Deborah Goodrich Royce's literary thrillers examine puzzles of identity, including Finding Miss Ford, Ruby Falls, and her recently published Reef Road, which was released just this month. Deborah began her career as an actress, starring as Silver Cane in All My Children. She went on to star in feature films, TV movies, and TV series, such as Beverly Hills 90210 and 21 Jump Street. So after the birth of her daughter, she entered the exciting world of screen development, reading, and script editing for screenplays such as Emma by Doug McGrath and early versions of Chicago and A Wrinkle in Time. Deborah and her husband Chuck are also big supporters of historic preservation, so even outside of all the writing, she makes time for that and also makes film a priority by serving on various governing and advisory boards and restoring historic buildings. So, Deborah, welcome to Jacksonville. All right, so Deborah will be joined in conversation with local author Jessica Hatch. Jessica Hatch is a professional freelance editor and novelist with more than a decade of publishing experience. Her debut novel, My Big Fake Wedding, debuted this year at #1 on Amazon's humorous American literature charts, and it was also an Early Victories book of 2022. Her next book, How to Keep a Husband for 10 Days, quite a feat, it's very hard to do, comes out in February. So keep an eye out for that book. When she is not writing, you can find her jogging on the River Walk or planning her next international trip. Jessica, I leave the rest to you.
Thank you, Imani, and thank you guys for being here, especially you, Deborah. Thank you.
Oh my goodness, thank you, Jessica.
And
I love that title, How to Keep a Husband for 10 Days?
For 10 days, and my editor made sure I worked it somewhere into the manuscript.
Love that, love that.
And I know those titles make it sound like, oh, well, she's a rom-com novelist, but let me tell you, I am a literary thriller lover. I love psychological thriller, true crime, so thank you for letting me interview you and get a nice early copy so I could be familiar enough with it for these questions. The first thing that I think pulls a lot of people in about Reef Road is this mention of a true unsolved murder. And in fact, I think, like I saw a tweet from Luann Rice earlier today, who seems to be a good friend of yours, and in the acknowledgments you mentioned that your family, your own family, has been haunted by an unsolved crime for generations, just like some of the characters in the novel. So could you talk a little bit more about that? Especially I'm interested in like when you were first aware of this impact on your family life.
Great question. Thank you, Jessica. So on December the 10th, 1948, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, it was a Friday night, my mother's best friend was murdered very violently. My mother and her friend were 12 years old. They had just been to the practice for the Christmas pageant at their church. They lived in the city of Pittsburgh in, I guess you'd call them row houses, houses that are attached with a door in the front and a door in the back. And Carol, the name of the real girl who was murdered, her parents were going bowling that night, and they left her very strict instructions of, locking the front door and locking the back door. And they were gone for several hours, and when they returned at 11:30, the kitchen door was unlocked, the shade was raised, it was a door with a window, and they found a trail of blood going from the kitchen where she had been baking a cake to surprise her parents into the dining room where she was collapsed on the floor next to the telephone. This has remained an unsolved crime all these years, which we are now in year 75 since the crime. And when the pandemic shut the world down in March of 2020, you all know where you were. For me, it was March the 13th, 2020, when awareness hit. It's my granddaughter's birthday, and there was that moment we were thinking, like, do we have anybody over? What do we do? And so I was here in Florida, and I thought I would finally take the time to research the real crime. It turns out there's a vast amount of material available now on the internet. So I will get to how long I've known about it. I feel as though I've known about the crime my whole life, although I know my mother did not tell me when I was little. So let's say when I was a teenager at some point, I knew about this. But when I really opened Aladdin's cave to look in and see what was there, every single newspaper article was uploaded. There were references to books on crime at the time. You know, one book was, it was a typical, those teeny pulp fiction books. It was called Terror in the Street, and there was a whole chapter on kind of this lawless and out of control Pittsburgh. As I was researching it, I thought, I don't want to write this as nonfiction. First of all, I don't write nonfiction. I feel you can get to a very crystallized essence of truth through fiction more easily than you can through non. For example, the real murdered girl had 2 brothers. That was very inconvenient to the plot, since suspicion has always fallen on one brother. And in fiction, it was just confusing to have this extra floating brother. So if I were writing it as nonfiction, I'd have to have that brother in. He existed, but in the way that I was doing it, exit brother number 1, so we just ended up with brother number 2. So I think that sort of answers your question of the what.
Yes, and I would love to hear a little bit more about, because as a writer, you know, write what you know, and what you're inspired by often comes from that lived experience. Do you feel comfortable talking about when you sort of were first aware of it, or did it impact your family life at all, this tragedy, this traumatic tragedy that had happened in your mother's life?
I'm very comfortable talking about it. Yeah, so I'm very intrigued by something that we call now generational trauma. It is a very real thing. We are affected by the things that happen to our parents and our grandparents. I've gone a little farther in my research. There's a really cool book. If the library doesn't have it, it's called It Didn't Start With You, and it's by a fellow called Mark Wolin, I think. And in that book, he even talks about generational trauma that affects us with things we don't know about. Like, you may have had let's say, a grandparent in a concentration camp in World War II. And that can have an effect on you. It can have an effect on your health and well-being in all different ways. So I was aware of this thing that happened. I knew my mother was overprotective. I knew my mother was overly fearful. I knew that my mom is still alive and well and living in Boynton Beach, Florida, and I had to let her know that I made the mother and the daughter in the book a lot less stable than I think we are for purposes of fiction. So when you read it, the mother is not exactly my mother, but there are threads of truth there. So my mother, her life was made much better by the invention of the home alarm system. That really increased her comfort zone. So Reef Road is a thriller, and it's a plot-driven thriller, but it has an underlying theme of generational trauma, and it's really examined really through the prism of multiple characters.
Yes, and actually that's a great lead-in. I wanted to talk a little bit about the themes of motherhood in this novel, because there are multiple different types of mothers in Reef Road. You mentioned the writer and her relationship with her mother, who's off the page and I believe no longer with us. And I don't feel it's giving away too much to say there's a dual narrative to this book. There are chapters that are the wife, and there are chapters that are writer's thoughts. The wife is a mother, and her mother-in-law has a fraught relationship, one great one with one of her sons, one not so great with the other one. And so I just wondered, when you were writing all of these different maternal characters in Reef Road, if there was one major theme you were trying to strike with all of them and they were different facets of it, or if each one is weaving her own story throughout it. Because, I mean, that to me is one of the huge literary themes of this book.
I want to marry you, Jessica. I want to take you everywhere. That's a good question. I love that question. Okay, spoiler alert, I am a mother. Any mothers out there, it's quite a ride, isn't it? Wow. We have 6 children. I have 2 biological daughters, 4 stepchildren, 6 grandchildren. They're all different. I've got a mother, and I'm super close with my mom, and it's been the best and the worst relationship of my life. And you know, it's kind of a thing, this mother-child relationship. So yeah, it's very much a theme. So Reef Road is a dual narrative. It's a story, this very internal thought process in the voice of this lonely middle-aged writer who's researching obsessively the murder of her mother's best friend and other crazy arcane murder statistics and stories, and she's got all of these ideas at her fingertips. And then there's almost like a book within a book, which is a much more paced out thriller, and it's the story of the wife. And Linda Alonso is a younger, more glamorous woman living in Palm Beach when the pandemic strikes, and she's married to this very dishy fellow from Argentina named Miguel Alonso. And about 3 weeks into the lockdown, Miguel is last seen boarding a plane at Miami International in his face mask with the 2 little children. And Linda cannot follow because, if you recall, at that moment of the real COVID lockdown, they closed the borders. So COVID turned out to be a wonderful constraint imposed on the characters. It kept them from doing things. It served a little bit like wartime as a box around the characters. So Linda, I would go so far as to say Linda Alonso's storyline is very noir. And if you are a fan of film noir, those incredible black and white films from the 1940s, or even as recently as something like Body Heat, which was filmed in Lantana, Florida, in I think the 1980s with Kathleen Turner and William Hurt. The woman is always up to something. The woman always has a little bit something going on in noir. And Linda is no exception to that rule. But she is a mother, and I think that is her shining glory. People ask me, do I like my characters? And I do. And what I like about Linda is her purity comes out as a mother. She really loves her 2 little children. I will say nothing more about her character, or we can say more. And the writer has a dog. She has this wonderful standard poodle, and she loves her dog. And she loves her own mother, too. Yeah, so that was very much a theme of this book. And I think it's something that no matter who you are, you have a mother theme. Even if you never knew your mother, there's a story there, too.
Yes, speaking of generational trauma, the mother wound, they say, everyone has one. I'd like to hold on to the dual narrative for a second, and trying to pick my words with this question because I know that the writer character is distanced from you, but obviously you're drawing from real life, so I want to make sure it's very clear I'm talking about the character and not about you when I use the terms I'm about to describe her with. I loved that with the dual narrative, we get to see a character either in close third person or first person right in their head, but then we also get to see them from other people's perspectives. I loved that, especially with the writer, it allowed us to see that what she feels are good intentions may to others seem unseemly or untoward or like a little creepy sometimes. And so do you feel that this is a fair reading of her, that, she's misunderstood by people? Or like you said, people ask you, do you like all of your characters? Do you think any character in a thriller should be entirely trustworthy, or should there always be some bit of, well, it makes sense in my head, but other people might see it as a little iffy?
I think that's very true. I think in my thrillers, you should look with a healthy dose of suspicion at each of the characters and what they're up to. You should really be paying close attention. I got a fantastic note from an editor on my second book, Ruby Falls, which is a more gothic thriller. It plays with the basic setup of Rebecca and goes to a very different conclusion. And her note, I am a film person for sure. She said, rewatch the movie The Sixth Sense. Have most of you seen The Sixth Sense? So there's a moment in the movie, and I won't spoil it for those of you who haven't, where a huge twist is revealed. And what they do in the film is they go back with flashbacks very quickly, and you see all the scenes, little snippets of scenes you've already seen, but the focus is completely different. And what you notice all of a sudden is completely different. So the note she gave, she said, people don't generally now want Agatha Christie anymore. And Agatha Christie is more of a locked room mystery where we're all here in this room, one of us ends up dead, one of us did it, and in the course of the book, it will be revealed it was that person over there. That's a reveal. In a twist, what happens is suddenly you become shockingly aware that what you thought was happening is not what is happening at all. So the note was, be sure that you lay the breadcrumb trail along the way. The reader won't necessarily see the clues, but when the twist comes, you want the reader to be able to say, oh, here, there, here, that's where I could have seen that. So that's what I do in my books, and I love a dual narrative. I love changing perspectives. I call my books identity thrillers, which is not really a genre, but what I like about that is I like those puzzles of identity, a Hitchcockian thriller, if you will, where you're really starting to look behind the curtain to see the secrets that people keep. I think we all have secrets. Most of our secrets are very benign, but occasionally, I think you'd all admit, you've met a person who had a secret that just knocked you for a loop, and those people stay in your minds. I knew a guy who was a fraud, and when it came out, years after I knew him, and he knew all these people I knew, that he was a complete and utter fraud. There was never really even a smoking gun of why this guy did what he did, but off he went to another town, and it just fascinated me. First of all, it seemed like such a pile of work to maintain a whole fraudulent identity. He was American, he pretended he was British. It was just, but it intrigues me.
That's incredible. I mean, I'm also a film buff, and I've been watching a lot of heist movies lately, so I would hate to meet a fraudster in real life, but they're fascinating fictional characters. Yeah. Let me see. I wanted, we'll get away from the murder, and I know, this is a Florida crowd, so I want to ask you about the South Floridian location, but one last murder question, I promise. There are 2 crimes in this novel, the one that you mentioned in the past that is based on a true unsolved murder, and then one that is in the more recent present. Was the more recent crime inspired by recent headlines around the start of the pandemic, or was it totally fabricated?
So the book begins, the prologue begins in Florida, the COVID lockdown. It's high noon. It's that moment when there's not even a shadow in the day. And 2 teenage boys sneak out of their house. Their mom has gone to the market. They go through the do not enter tape that's blocking the beach. Were your beaches blocked here? They sneak around it. They've got their surfboards. They can barely walk on the sand. It's so hot. And they see these seagulls hovering around something. Turns out to be a human hand, a man's hand, with a gold wedding band. And so that is the revelation, a sneak peek at the modern crime. But I had to get my surfer lingo and body language correct. But one of my favorite things to write there is they're brothers, Colson and Rand, surfer boys. And one says to the other, dude, do you think it's real? And the other one says, the seagulls do.
Great line.
So that is the glimpse of what you're about to figure out. And I love starting it with that. Do you have surfing beaches around here? Yeah. So I always thought surfers carried their surfboards on their shoulders. I have been instructed no, under the arm. So I hope I got that right. So that's the hint at the modern crime. So you're going back and forth, you know, tick-tock, 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 between the old crime, the new crime, and what they have to do with each other.
Okay. So it seems perhaps the one that's more recent was more a work of fiction to prop up the themes and the more farther in the past crimes.
Yes, work of fiction.
Words escaped me there for a second.
Fiction.
Okay, cool. Yes, so I love a novel with a strong sense of place, and if you're looking for that, you've got it in Reef Road. South Florida feels like its own character here. So I wondered if you could tell, especially those more writerly readers among us, like, what is your secret sauce for making the reader feel like she's right there with everyone? Is there a type of sense imagery that you lean on, or something else that you do?
So I love writing real places. All my novels are set in real places. They're fictitious stories in places that I know or places that I go to. For me, I always get just this thrill when I'm reading a book or watching a movie that's somewhere I've been, and I think, oh, I know where that market is. I don't know why. And so I make sure that everything is the distance I say it is, or it's walkable. And I'm so bad with distance. And in one of my books, somebody's following someone at night, and I'm asking my husband, like, 50 yards, how far is 50 yards? He's like, well, think of football. I'm like, that doesn't help me. Can you hear them? So Florida, in the pandemic, where I was in Palm Beach, it was like the Twilight Zone. First of all, Palm Beach is physically beautiful, but I would write all morning, and I would ride my bike up and down the island of Palm Beach in the afternoon, and there was nobody out, so that was weird. And I picked a street. We're going to see the reception I get from the people who really live on Reef Road. It's a real street, very cute street, and a mixed street for Palm Beach. There's a southern section of Palm Beach which is all big mansions, but Reef Road is not that. It's like 3-bedroom ranch houses from the 1960s, and that's what I liked about it. It's very neighborhoody. The island of Palm Beach is its narrowest at the north end. They call the intracoastal in Palm Beach the lake for Lake Worth. So it's very narrow between the lake and the ocean. And the streets up there, it feels to me a little bit more like what I would think of as Venice Beach, California. Kind of, people are outside barefooted and not in COVID. So it felt more family-oriented, but I also love the name Reef Road. It sounds a little bit like Cape Fear or Lookout Mountain, like a slightly perilous place. You could run aground. Something bad could happen to you on Reef Road, and it will. So we have a boat, so we're not really good boating people, so I talk to boating people, and I'm like, so how far is it to the Gulf Stream? And could you go to the Gulf Stream at night? And how long would it take you to get out there? And what if you were dumping something in the Gulf Stream? How long would it take to go up to Nantucket? So that kind of stuff, I'm not going to tell you what it has to do with, but I've researched it because I do think it's more cinematic, it's more real. You can completely visualize it when it's clearly written. There should be no vagueness, I think, about place. There should be clarity. I learned one more thing. For me, the visual is paired with words. And I learned in college, I went to college in Ohio, and we were sitting around in the dorm, and the girls started asking questions like, well, describe the ladies' shower room when you're not in it. And I found I couldn't. I couldn't remember what the wallpaper was exactly like, and I couldn't remember the exact configuration of the tiles on the floor. So for me, my memory exercise is to compare it with words. Like if I were to describe your beautiful skirt, I would have to say the words, it's a black background, and there are 2 colors of green leaves, etc. And somehow when I say the words, I remember the visual image. It's like it's married in my head. So that's my little trick.
Okay, so very visually imagistic, and I mean, it's a treat. I can't wait for you guys to get into this. Also, I love that you ask your husband about distance, and I've had some make-out scenes where I'm like, wait, so if your hand's here, the research you have to do. Well, if South Florida is a character, I think COVID feels like one as well. You've talked about that a little bit. I think you've talked very well about how the pandemic impacted you as an individual and as a writer, how it inspired this novel. And, you know, this is just kind of a conversational question. Some writers that I have worked with have chosen to set their books like during the pandemic times, but just not refer to it. And I love that you didn't glance away from it, but like used it to your advantage. Do you know, I mean, creative license being what it is, but do you have any opinion on books you've read since the pandemic that have come out and it's just like, what pandemic?
Yeah, for me, I thought it was very important to address it. Like I said, it's like a wartime book. There are things, if a story's playing out in Paris in World War II, there are things that are constraining the characters. There are Germans marching around. There are searches going on. There are people being hauled off in the night. And with COVID, it felt like we were living through such an extraordinary moment in time. And the book is not about COVID. It's not like you're going to read it and think, oh my God, I'm completely mired in that again. But it really did set these limitations around the characters, and it also set them on edge. It had an effect on all of us. And, you know, again, Linda's husband leaving, her not being able to follow. The face mask is a very good device in a thriller. So all of that, people kept meeting people in face masks. It was, I think it was important to touch on it. And I don't think it's overwhelming, but I think it was that moment in time.
I agree. I didn't feel like it was overwhelming. I felt like it added nuance in a really great way. Yeah, thank you for that. I want to pivot a little bit and ask some questions on like craft and your life as a writer. There's this great quote. This is the only like little excerpt from the book that I will be reading. You have to read the rest on your own. It's just one sentence, but it's from one of the writer's thoughts sections. She's talking about having had a longer career as a writer, and she says, "Writing is writing, but it is also all this other stuff, like bookstagram that it never used to be." Can you talk a little bit more about that, especially self-promotion as an author in the 21st century?
So, I was an actress in my first career. I was a story editor in my second career. I'm on career 3000 now because, I'm a woman of a certain age. So I really did come into the writing world post-Instagram and all this stuff. I really came into it knowing I had to hustle and show up and meet people and promote myself and do all these things. So I'm very comfortable with it. But I have spoken to writers who are my age but are longer stream in their writing career who have really groused about, I shouldn't have to do this and my publisher should do that. So I wanted to put a little bit of that voice into this writer.
That's fantastic. Yeah, it's tough if you've started being published in, say, the 80s when publicity had a bigger budget and things like that. I want to let the audience know that we'll be doing the audience Q&A in about 10 minutes, possibly less. I have one more question that I really want to get to. Just a reminder to the audience here in the room, the note cards are under your seat. Someone will come and get them. I think also Zoom can ask questions in the chat. And while I'm doing this little brief interlude, I want to thank the Friends of the Beaches Library for sponsoring this. Yes, round of applause for that. And you spoke about your first career, your second career, and now you've got your third one. And I love that you have this multidisciplinary background. I'm a firm believer that especially pursuing, there can be other subject matter, but especially other art forms like acting or music, because you understand the technicalities of that form, can help improve writing in certain ways. If you know that in music there's such a thing as a leitmotif, then you know that maybe you can have something happen multiple times phrasing-wise in a novel. Or acting, you know how to get into a character's head so much better than some people. So how, if at all, which I assume quite a bit, how do you feel that working as an actress and also as a story editor, which is a very particular role in the film industry, I hope you can explain to our audience, how have those impacted your writing?
Well, to me, everything goes together. I think we are all these kind of, crazy quilts or mosaics or whatever you want to call it, of everything we've ever done, every relationship we've ever had. It's all there. It's in us. It's who we are. Little things pop up in our heads as we go along. And so I think I'm no different from anyone there. So I was an actress for 10 years. I was on All My Children. I did a bunch of movies. But talking about getting into a character's head, I did the TV movie with Mark Harmon about Ted Bundy. And I played the woman who married Bundy in Florida. Everything is going back to Florida. She followed him from the Pacific Northwest. She helped spring him out of jail. She followed him down here, and he put her on the witness stand in his final murder trial and said, "Will you marry me?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, I do hereby marry you," which was crazy from the get-go. So how do you get into a woman's head like that? The question we ask about people often is, what was she thinking? What was she thinking? And the only thing I could come up with her is she didn't believe he did it. She just did not believe he did it. So that was how I approached her. So, and I do that really with every character I write in a book. I try to get into, who is this character? Why? In acting, you say, what is my motivation? And I think if you use that for all your characters, it's very helpful. Story editing is like being a book editor. You're not cutting film, that's just the editor. The story editor is the person working with the writers. So for me, it was an incredible opportunity. I was at Miramax in the 90s, which was really the heyday of their body of work, just one incredible movie after the next. And I felt like I was, those merry-go-rounds that you do with your feet when you're a kid and you run, and you jump on? I feel like I jumped on that kind of merry-go-round, and I was given a huge opportunity as a former actress to really get my act together and figure out how to edit the writing of people who were, light years ahead of me as writers. And boy, I worked hard to pull that together. Mini story about that and the life of a work of art. When I was at Miramax, I was the editor on A Wrinkle in Time. We had that in development. That had been a children's book written in the 1960s by Madeleine L'Engle. 30 years later, it ended up on my editorial desk. And as we were working on it, the writer, her husband died. It was just a terrible thing, and the project just fell apart. And I would have told you at that moment in time, this project is dead. It will never happen. 20 years after that, the Black American female director, Ava DuVernay, made that movie with a multiracial cast, and I was so awed and humbled, and I thought, there's a 50-year trajectory from the page to the movie it was meant to be, and I was a tiny speck somewhere along that path, and it made me realize that there's something so much bigger going on, and wherever we are at any moment in time, we think, that didn't work, that's not gonna happen, that's a failure. And that movie had a destiny that was way beyond me, and I was really blown away by that.
I had chills when you were talking about the 50-year trajectory. That's incredible. And just one little follow-up question that you made me think of when you said I was just a little blip in that process. I've no experience in the film industry, but as I understand it, it's always like so many people bringing even a TV show to the screen. Do you miss that collaborative atmosphere when it's just you and an editor and maybe some beta readers?
Making a movie work, I think, having had, a decade in front of the camera, a decade behind the camera, it's a miracle. It is a miracle. And anybody tells you that they fully understand the secret sauce, I don't know. I mean, so I was instrumental in choosing that particular version of Emma, Jane Austen's book, which we did with the director Doug McGrath, and he sadly just died. He's exactly my age, and he was actually performing on Broadway and had a massive heart attack. And this was the one with Gwyneth Paltrow. So what made it work? Doug's script was fabulous. His direction was great. Gwyneth was great. Was it the editing? Was it the music? Was it? I think it all has to come together in a way that's so indefinable to make a movie work. And you can have all of those great elements in a movie, like, well, why didn't that work? Those actors are wonderful. I love that director, but it just didn't sing. My answer is, I have no idea. None.
It's alchemy, I guess. So thank you. Those are all of my questions. I'm going to start asking you some audience ones, which look like they're great. I'm going to start with a very large but very simple question. What is the best part of writing a book to you?
The best part of writing a book, it's a very clear answer for me, is when you are really in the process and there is this moment where something is just moving along and moving through you, and you find yourself thinking, I never would have thought of that. And in a way you didn't.
Yeah. It's like a quickening. It's like it comes to life. Yeah. Speaking of like maternal language. Another great one about writing, do you write every day, whether you are in the middle of a novel or not? That is, do you subscribe to the belief that a writer, quote unquote, must write for X hours per day? Or are you a little more forgiving with yourself?
All right. I'm 64 years old. And if I couldn't be forgiving with myself, I would just get under this table. I was very hard on myself as a young woman. I had an eating disorder for 6 years. I mean, I was hard on myself. So I lead a very disciplined life. I am not a lazy person, but when the little voice comes, and I have that voice that starts to beat up on myself, I work very hard to have a conversation with that voice. I have a meditation practice. I don't meditate long. I get up in the morning. I have some quiet time. I read something inspirational and take a little quiet time. I have to start my day that way. I do try to write every day. I don't succeed to write every day. Technology is a huge helper for me. I use my iPhone or my computer to block out time. I find that I do obey the screen. If it tells me, this is my 3-hour window, I will sit down. But anybody who tells you you have to write in the morning, you have to do this, I'm like, I'm so glad that works for you. That's just so nice. I can't do that.
No, I think writing advice, you have to go down the buffet line, pick what you think is going to work for you, try it on. I'm mixing metaphors, but you get where I'm going with that. We spoke about, place as a character itself. What other places do you aspire to write into your novels?
Oh, I'm so glad you've asked. So my first book, Finding Mrs. Ford, is the story of a woman whose past catches up with her when the FBI comes to her house in beautiful Watch Hill, Rhode Island, which is like a Newport, a northern New England seaside community. And they ask her about an Iraqi man. She pretends she doesn't know. And you start going back and forth to her checkered youth in Detroit, when she most certainly knew a whole group of Iraqis. There's a group of Iraqis in Detroit. So I loved writing Watch Hill in its most pristine and beautiful, and Detroit in 1979. Anybody from Detroit? Yeah, so it was a little rough around the edges then. So I love that contrast. Ruby Falls, I really wrote Los Angeles, and to me, Ruby Falls is a love letter to Los Angeles. It's like a dream. My first studio, when Paramount Pictures flew me out there, was Paramount. And, you know, they have those gates, you think of Sunset Boulevard, and I set it in the Hollywood Hills, and we all know the twists and turns of those streets and those lampposts with those frosted glass, like acorn-shaped globes, and we know what that tick, tick, tick of a lady's high heels sounds like walking down that Hollywood street. So I just wanted, through the prism, because it's a reference to Rebecca, and Rebecca is so dreamlike. It begins at Manderley. It begins with that great sentence, "Last night I dreamt I went to Manderley again." And you think, what is this place? Why can't she go there? I mean, you already know it's a dreamy place. So I wanted Los Angeles to come off that way, because I think we all know Los Angeles, even if we've never been there. We're more than 100 years into American cinema. It is our place. So I wanted to write that. Now I've written Florida and a little bit Pittsburgh. The book I'm working on now is set in Greenwich, Connecticut, where I live. And if you want a sneak peek, I got a letter, an email this year from a guy who said, "Remember me? I was your best boy on Survival Game." Now that is a very provocative sentence. So if you know anything about the movie business, you know a best boy is the head electrician. So that, I know what that means. Survival Game was a movie I did with the son of Chuck Norris. Do you remember Chuck Norris? His son did a movie. I did it with him. So, all right, you know, he's written this one sentence, and then he said, you know, remember that Thanksgiving dinner we had in Santa Cruz? And I'm thinking, he said, remember when we ran into each other at the Cannes Film Festival, and you were waving and holding a baby, and I wondered for a minute, could that baby be mine? And I'm thinking, why don't I remember this man? What's the matter with me? Who is he? So I Google him. He's a real man. I see his face. I'm like, I don't know, maybe vaguely familiar. I really wouldn't pick him up out of a lineup. And I thought, well, isn't that an interesting premise? What if you have a woman who's left the movie business, she has a nice little suburban housewife life in Greenwich, and she gets this email, she doesn't remember him, but what if there's something about her and her memory? And what if he's telling the truth, but what if he's not? So my darling husband, I wish he were here, every place I write, he's like, we're gonna get kicked out of Watch Hill. We're gonna get kicked out of Palm Beach. So I might be moving up here, save room for me. So now he's saying we're gonna get kicked out of Greenwich.
Oh my gosh, I hope not, it's a beautiful city. Wow, I'm so excited for whatever this book, I guess that'll be like 2025. We get to look forward to that.
Distance. And I'm thinking of calling it Best Boy.
Ugh, just like different chills for that one. This question asker says, I'm on the younger side, between 12 and 16 years old, but I love writing short stories, novels, etc. Will that affect how likely I am to actually publish a book? I think will that affect is their age.
Absolutely. You are so way ahead of me, wherever you are, you beautiful young person. You're so way ahead. Yes, of course it will. And if you're on screen, of course it will. The more you do something, I mean, think about Malcolm Gladwell, his 10,000 hours. What book was that? Blink? Anybody?
Is it Outliers?
Outliers.
Yep.
So the idea is the more you do something, the more comfortable you are, the more at ease you are, the more, and the more you trust your own voice, which is a really important thing as a writer, because I think a lot of times when we start writing, we have our icons and we want to write a little bit like them, but then as we go along, you know, I'm a big believer in writing groups, as long as you're with kind people. You must be with kind people. And you start to see, not that you write for other people, but you do start to see that things people recognize in your way of expressing yourself, your way of telling something, and it gives you confidence in what you do. It doesn't make you change what you do for them. It gives you confidence in the way you do things. So, yeah, you are ahead of the game.
Yeah, especially with finding your voice at an earlier age, because it takes time. That's the thing. And in fact, I think it's the Gotham Writing Workshop in New York. Their style for early, like 101 novel writing is submit a short story in the style of Raymond Chandler. Like, so you're learning different people's styles, and then you get to learn how you like it.
Which makes you versatile and
Yes.
malleable. It gives you a sort of ease of use. Absolutely.
Speaking of those icons, who are some of your favorite authors to read?
So right now, I'm reading a lot of Joyce Carol Oates. What I love about her is she really switches genres and switches style, and she does have that ease and confidence in different voices. I went back and read something recently. I was reading a book by Alice McDermott on writing, and so I went back and read Charming Billy, which I think won the Pulitzer Prize. Oh my God, it's a beautiful book. It's about an alcoholic uncle who dies, and it is the most gorgeous and loving portrait of this person. You know, we look at addiction through many lenses. Lens of fear, lens of, you know, many lenses. But she looks at it as a loving family member, and it's just an incredible book. If you haven't read Charming Billy, I recommend it.
Thank you for that. My to-be-read pile is so tall, but I'm going to add some more. We have about 10 minutes left, just want to let people know. And then if you're here in person, Deborah is going to be available, I think, to sign books after this, which is a real treat. Just a couple more questions. At what point in your multifaceted career did you know that you wanted to write novels? And has this always been your goal, or a love that you found along the way?
So I'd been writing for a long time. I was a secret writer. Right after I left Miramax in around 2000, I wrote a screenplay and got a grant for it, but then my life changed directions and I never submitted it. So I think for me, really, for many, many years, the key was writing in these. I belonged to two different writing groups, and they were very nurturing for me. So So in the sequence of my life, it was really this moment in my mid-50s of the empty nest when I got very serious with my time. And I started telling friends I'm writing a novel, and my husband was like, oh my God, I just wouldn't say that. I said, you know what? I have had this secret writing life for a long time, and it hasn't worked out so well in really getting me going. So what's the worst that could happen? So I start telling my friends, I mean, I wasn't like publishing it on billboards or anything. If I tell my friends I'm writing a novel, a few years from now, if they say to me, hey, Deborah, whatever happened to that novel? The worst I can say is nothing. And it was a good motivator for me to kind of help me to start structuring my time.
That's fantastic. So this request says, the cover art for Reef Road is gorgeous. I have to agree. What is the story behind it?
Wow, did you see the spider? So I love all my book covers. I've been able to have a voice in my book covers. My book covers, they're always gorgeous, but slightly off. So we can show you. So it's the most magnificent bird of paradise against this stark black background, but there's a spider in it. And let me tell you something, you really have to figure out a spider when you put it on the cover of a book, because it can't be too gross, because there might be people who don't touch your book. So the versions of spiders we went through, and then you go through, like, if you have a bird of paradise, where is it on the page? Where do you put the words and all that? But I'm very pleased with it. Very, very pleased.
That's fantastic, and good on you for getting to have some impact on your cover art. Not every author gets that, by the way, so that's really awesome about your relationship with your publisher. And last question, is this the last one? Yes. Nice little bow we're going to tie on it. You mentioned the library or a library in Reef Road. What role has the library played in your writing and your, the person says, quote unquote, real life?
The library has played a huge role in my life. I grew up going to my town library. You know, when I lived in Los Angeles with little children, the day activity would be to push the stroller to the library, to spend the time at the library, to walk home via the bakery and get something nice and go home. I mean, I think going to libraries in every town, everywhere, in Westerly, Rhode Island, which is near Watch Hill where we go. There's a magnificent library from the 1890s, but it's not the building, of course, it's what's in it. And it's fascinating to me how libraries are changing to accommodate our lives and allow people to utilize them in different ways. And I think libraries are gathering places too. You know, it's a place you can go anytime and be anybody and walk in the door and generally find what you're looking for.
Yes. I recently heard someone call a library one of the last few places you can go in public without having to pay to be in there. And I think that's a very important part of society that's gradually going away. Well,
I think that's true. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Deborah, thank you so much for talking with me. It's been an absolute treat. And I hope you guys will really enjoy reading Reef Road, because I know I did. So.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you.